Welcome to episode 4 of the Syria podcast, and I'm joined once again by Vanessa Beeley. Welcome to the program, Vanessa.
Thanks, Mike.
So, I don't know where to start with this because a lot has happened since the last time we spoke, and various statements from as relations with the so-called new regime in Syria are attempted to be normalized by multiple countries, including Russia, and that's perhaps the most surprising aspect of this for me.
Yeah, I mean, the new regime, let's remember it's not elected, it's a transitional government, although at the moment they do appear to be appointing governors and ministers that have almost across the board, in fact, fully across the board, affiliations to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham or to other organizations like Qada al-Sham that were responsible for a number of sectarian massacres across Syria between 2011 and 2024, or let's say up until 2020. So the government that is currently being formed is one, transitional, two, it's not elected, three, it's being recognized and legitimized by the regimes in the West that effectively established these organizations and armed them and funded them and promoted them in order to carry out sectarian atrocities against the Syrian people as part of the regime change operation. So we're living in a kind of hideous dystopia from which there seems to be no escape at the moment.
So you've mentioned two of these groups. How many groups are there actually involved in this new government?
Well, I mean, you would have to assume the groups that are under the control of HTS. I did actually publish something on this back in 2021. There are a large number of groups, let's say more than 20, that comprise not only Syrians, but also a large number of foreign extremist mercenaries like the Kurdish Salafists, the Chechens, the Uzbeks, the Turkmenistan, the Uyghurs. 10,000 Uyghurs are currently inside Syria. And of course, the Chinese embassy has come under direct attack from them, one assumes, in Damascus. So HTS is a loose umbrella for the militant forces that are now running riot inside Syria. And while they claim they're trying to maintain some kind of peace and order and security, we know for a fact that certain militant groups are establishing sieges of, for example, Alawite towns and villages in the coastal areas and have been carrying out sectarian pogroms in villages around Homs and so on. So, it's a very mixed bag at the moment. But of course, the West is trying to portray this as the reformed HTS, which is now Jolani has had the bounty lifted off his head. His name has been changed to Ahmed al-Sara, even though the al-Sara family deny all knowledge of his existence. So as I said, we're just living in this insane world right now where all the sanctions that we used to collectively punish the Syrian people for the last decade at least are now going to be lifted because the terrorists that the West was supporting or were supporting are back in charge now on behalf of the West, Turkey, Israel, Qatar.
What became of the government ministers that didn't leave the country? Is there any indication if they are involved in helping create this new transitional government, or if there's any potential role for them, assuming that at some point in the future this transitional government transitions to something else?
Assuming, that's a big assumption.
Yes.
To what degree will it be able to hold on to power? Of course, that's the other question, because there is going to be infighting just as there was in Idlib. Things were not stabilized in Idlib. We talked on Wednesday about the arbitrary executions that were carried out by the HDS, so-called Salvation Government in Idlib, the imprisonment, the punishment for protesters against Islamic rule in Idlib, etc. And so far, we're not seeing any. Initially, we saw the original prime minister being involved in the first few days, but I haven't seen or heard from him since then, while Jolani is appointing ministers and governors for various governorates in Syria from within the HTS military forces.
Obviously, in the first number of days following the change of regime, there was quite a lot of violence, people being murdered in hospital beds, summary executions everywhere, hangings, shootings, beheadings. What is the current situation? Has that situation continued?
Exactly the same, particularly in areas like the coastal areas where there are the majority of the Alawite communities, towns and villages, and the Shia communities, and of course many of the government officials that you mentioned, and even military, fled to the coastal areas for safety. And so therefore we are seeing sweeping operations by affiliates of HTS who are declaring themselves as affiliates of HTS through these towns and villages, rooting out, as the West likes to call them, the henchmen of Assad. So this kind of revenge killing, which is also being normalized and justified by the likes of the BBC and CNN, we've seen Jeremy Bowen virtually relishing the idea of an execution of an Assad henchman in Damascus very recently. We've seen him interviewing Jolani with very softball questions, almost as if the answers have been prepared from Jolani, just as they always have been, of course, from the likes of the White Helmets and so on across the last sort of 10 years. We know that they're being managed and controlled.
And the problem with that kind of interview, isn't it, is that we don't get to see the interview as the full thing, because it's a simultaneous translation, so it's carefully edited to make sure, because obviously, I mean, we don't want to see the whole thing. We just want to see the questions and the answers. We don't want to see the conversation that goes on in between. So that is a very carefully edited and packaged piece, and we can't know how genuine that is.
It's crafted. And, you know, when you have Bowen describing someone who was originally with ISIS, then with Al Qaeda, as someone who has great vision, is intelligent, and so on, like literally waxing lyrical about him. And as you've brought up, how come? I mean, the US now has apparently lifted its 10 million bounty on Jolani after Matthew Miller, the US State Department spokesperson, said that no US official is going to collect the reward, even if they point out where Jolani is, because everyone knows where Jolani is, right? But for the BBC to sit down with someone that is the leader of what is still a proscribed terrorist organization, and yet there is absolutely no recrimination for Bowen or for the other BBC correspondents on the ground, or for Parrick O'Brien with Channel 4 on the ground and speaking to members of the terrorist groups. There's absolutely no recriminations for them for basically promoting and platforming a terrorist organization. Like, how does this work? We know how this works, of course, but that's largely a rhetorical question.
On that theme, I wrote to counterterrorism police in the UK about this situation and asked two questions. I asked, is there an ongoing investigation into comments made by various people regarding HTS? And if not, what is the difference between the comments made by those alleged to be supportive of Hamas and those apparently supportive of HTS? And why are the latter not considered to be in breach of the Terrorism Act? And the answer that I got back from the counterterrorism police was, in media interviews yesterday, our senior national coordinator of counterterrorism policing confirmed that no arrests have been made under Section 12 linked to HTS since the latest developments in Syria. If you want full/historic data sets on this over a certain period of time, you need to submit freedom of information requests into relevant forces as per the usual process. We wouldn't confirm what may or may not be the subject of a counterterrorism police investigation. And that was sent to me on the 19th of December. Take that as it is. They have no intention. Clearly, it seems that while they're not confirming that whether there's going to be any investigation into these, that they're saying that no arrests have been made, and there's no indication that there would be any.
Oh, but anyone that is supporting the resistance in Palestine or Lebanon is immediately under suspicion of supporting prescribed groups, even if they haven't fraternized with those prescribed groups or platformed those prescribed groups. Just they are against the genocide that's being committed by the Zionist regime, right? So, I mean, this is extraordinary. You know, if you're against genocide by Israel, you can be arrested, you can be detained, you can be imprisoned, if you're protesting in the UK against the supply of weapons to the Zionist regime to carry out the genocide in Gaza and in the occupied territories, you can be held in remand and basically put through Abu Ghraib-style torture methods when you're only being charged effectively with aggravated burglary. But if the BBC state media, UK state media, can go and glorify arbitrary execution without trial, without prosecution, without any kind of judicial process, and can glorify and lionize someone who was previously with ISIS, with Al-Qaeda, and was responsible for atrocities against the Syrian people. I mean, this is just for people to really understand the rotten core of our establishment in the UK and in the West in general, and that none of us are safe in this kind of environment. None. Because they will always be protected, because they protect the establishment. We will never be protected because we stand against the establishment.
Let me ask a controversial question, because I just feel that we need to put a line in the sand here. Is there no redemption for Gilani and people like him?
When something is an ideological driver of someone's behavior, and within that I include the sectarianism, the violence, which continued in Idlib. The fact that Idlib is being presented as some kind of example of fair governance inside Syria, and that should be repeated by HTS in the rest of Syria. This is insane, because we know even through opposition aligned media outlets and humanitarian or human rights organizations in Syria that this is not true. Even if you take out the terrorist activities, why should they walk away scot-free, Mike? If they committed crimes as the groups they once were, even if they had an epiphany, should they not face trial for what they did? Even if they changed, which I do not believe for 1 second that they have, because those crimes are still continuing. It's just that the HTS leadership is trying to distance itself from them. And of course, they're being managed by Turkish intelligence, by Mossad, by CIA, by MI6, just as they have throughout this war. We know this from the leaked UK Foreign Office documents about, when was it, 3 years ago. So redemption, there should be no redemption, should there, without some kind of payment for the crimes you've committed.
That is how I would view this situation. There has to be some reckoning for what was done. I mean, you and I, well, you particularly have covered for many, many years the atrocities that have been perpetrated by these groups, including beheadings of children and blowing up of buses with children on them and so on. So, and that's just scratching the surface.
And crucifixion and torture and detention. I mean, in East Aleppo alone, people were crucified. They were held underground in kind of sewage pipes with the lid put back down on top of them. The eye hospital was converted into a Sharia court and a detention center where people were abused and tortured for having any kind of affiliation with the Syrian government. There were multiple crimes carried out. Children used as suicide bombers. I mean, if we look at Abdullah Mahizani, who was in charge of one of the terrorist coalitions, he was responsible, paid by Saudi Arabia to recruit and train child suicide bombers. We know that child suicide bombers were used even in districts of Damascus by these groups. The crimes are endless, and yet we seem to be entering this phase of, as Peter Ford calls it, the Assad Holocaust, where everything is going to be attributed to Assad, and that's it. So they will get off scot-free. They'll come out of this smelling of roses if Western media and Western regimes have anything to do with it, until, of course, they become too difficult to manage, which is what usually happens with these kind of proxy forces, whether it's in Afghanistan or in Libya and so on. And then they'll become dispensable. But you can't. You can take a terrorist and put them in a suit and trim their beard and put them on PBS and CNN, but they're still a terrorist.
At this point, I still have no real understanding of what happened over the last few weeks, in the sense that up until a point, apparently there was a stable country in Syria, and within a matter of a couple of days, that not only evaporated, but it was almost as if HTS was welcomed. What changed within the government that was around Assad that allowed that to happen?
I don't think anything changed within the government around Assad. But what I would like to do, because it all began in Aleppo, and what I would like to reiterate, first of all, is that it was well known that Jolani was planning an extensive attack from inside Idlib. It is well known that Russia and Turkey brokered the ceasefire deal back in 2020 that, if you like, gave Jolani's forces the time to develop their military structure, to develop their weapons capability with the help of NATO member states that we know were sending special forces into Idlib to train them, with the help of Turkey that was providing surveillance from and drone warfare from within its 150 bases in the north and the northwest of Syria, and latterly from Ukraine. Ukraine special forces were in Idlib helping to train Jolani's military, which, as I reiterate, also comprised probably 50%, conservatively speaking, foreign mercenaries, extremist mercenaries from all places in the world, from just about everywhere. If we look back at the 2014 map, we can see that the terrorist forces were coming in from pretty much everywhere. And so therefore, it was very well known, and it should have been very well known by, for example, Russia, that this was happening. It was certainly well known by Turkey, because Turkey was involved in the training and the empowerment of Jolani's forces and of the formerly Free Syrian Army forces occupying the north of Syria, now known as the Syrian National Army, and under the direct control of Erdogan. Free Syrian Army that also carried out atrocities against the Syrian people alongside Nusra Front, or Al-Qaeda, that then under Jolani became HTS, was rebranded by the West, basically. So that's the first thing. So Russia should have been well aware of the fact that this attack was building. There were 30,000 troops at Aleppo in preparation for this attack. There were numbers of Christian National Defense Forces stationed in Hama who were well aware that this attack was incoming. Now, when I spoke to military personnel that I know leading up to it, there was a sense of unease. I couldn't get to the bottom of that unease because, people don't talk very freely about military issues and so on, particularly when it comes to Russia or even Iran. But I did pick up on unease amongst them, that something was not right, or that they were unsupported, let's say. Then the attack happened. Now, if I can, I want to come to Putin's recent press conference, because I want to point out three big untruths in Putin's conference response to, I think it was a British journalist. I want to do this because I think it lays the ground for the discussion we need to have. And I also want to be very clear with people that I'm piecing things together. It takes a long time. This is an incredibly complex situation. I have a lot of information from very reliable sources that nobody else will have. People are jumping to conclusions. They're being led to conclusions. They're allowing their cognitive dissonance, perhaps, on Russia's role to cloud their judgment as to whether Russia might have played a role in facilitating the takeover of the country or not. So this is where I'm coming from, right? I'm just trying to piece the information together that I have and to make sense of it. People can disagree with me, people can argue with me, but they should at least try to argue from a better informed position than me if they're going to argue with me, if that makes sense. What did Putin say? First of all, he claims that they didn't deploy any ground forces in Syria. They were simply not present there. Our presence consisted solely of two bases, an air base and a naval base. The ground operations were conducted by the Syrian armed forces, and as is widely known, there is no secret here of certain pro-Iranian combat units. Now, this is palpably untrue. Russia had an estimated 100 military bases or positions inside Syria, including on the southern border, next to the ceasefire line between Israel and Syria. I saw for myself convoys of Russian troops heading from Damascus back to Haifa. And are they trying to tell us that those 100 bases dotted across Syria, including in the northeast, by the way, had no manpower there? That's impossible. Now, what they might argue is that they were Chechen troops that were working on behalf of Russia inside Syria, as they did after the liberation of Aleppo. I don't know, because it wasn't clarified in Putin's response. So then what does he say about
Well,
what
hold on,
happened?
just before we go on to the next one, I'd be interested to know, when you use the term base there, what are you talking about? Are these deployments of various sizes, or what kind of base are we talking about?
They're deployments of various sizes. I mean, I visited one when I went to the Kurdish-held areas, not in the far northeast, but Manbij and to the northeast of Manbij, back in, gosh, probably 4 years ago now. I actually went to Russian bases there. And, no, they're not vast, extensive bases. They're very similar to the American bases. Relatively small positions where there's, let's say, 30, 40 Russian troops, for example. But then you're talking 100 of these bases across Syria and in Damascus, for example, and in the south, right? So very similar to the American presence in a way, very similar.
But the key point is there were Russians or Russian, whatever, Chechen, whoever, whatever, they were there as representing Russia.
Yeah. So, this is what I'm trying to show is there is a degree of gaslighting going on about this narrative. And I'm not accepting the Russian official narrative right now, or certain aspects of it. So then let's have a look at what he says about what transpired. When armed opposition groups advanced towards Aleppo, the city was defended by approximately 30,000 personnel. He's meaning Syrian Arab Army personnel in the west and in the east. However, when 350 militants, I don't know where he gets this figure from, entered the city, the government forces, along with the pro-Iranian units, withdrew without resistance, demolishing their positions as they left. Now, this is really important. I can't at the moment speak for the West because I don't have the full picture on the Western defense of Aleppo. But on the Eastern defense of Aleppo, I have it reliably confirmed that the Syrian Arab Army brigades stood their ground, that Commander Sergei Kissel, who was then commander of the Russian forces, left and abandoned the Syrian Arab Army and was spotted leaving and heading back to Haifa by the Iranian reinforcements that were coming in to help the Syrian Arab Army at that point. So again, this doesn't comply with Putin's narrative. Now, Putin might be misinformed. This might be what his intelligence agencies and his military and defense people are telling him, right? So this isn't, if you like, it's not a personal attack on Putin, but then again, he's responsible for knowing exactly what went on the ground. And then he goes on to say this pattern was observed across nearly the entire Syrian territory, with only minor exceptions where skirmishes occurred. Now, again, the brigades that were in the east, I know for a fact, they then moved to the south. They engaged the terrorists to liberate people who were trapped in the Al-Safira area to the south of Aleppo. So they were still involved in fighting at this point against the terrorists and liberating their people who were getting trapped in the skirmishes or in the battles. So they liberated the people from Nubal and Zara who had evacuated out of fear for their lives because those two villages had been targeted previously by HTS and al-Sham for ethnic cleansing. We mentioned that also, I think, either this week or the week before on UK Column News. Now, this is where, let me just finish with Putin's untruths. That's how I'm going to describe them. So he then goes on to say, we facilitated the relocation of 4,000 Iranian fighters. So I presume this means IRGC to Tehran from Haimaim Air Base. Some pro-Iranian units withdrew to Lebanon and others to Iraq without engaging in combat. Now, I have spoken to, again, incredibly reliable people that I trust entirely, particularly from their analysis on the military situation, because they have contacts within the Iranian military forces inside Syria. And this is what they told me. Russia did not evacuate any Iranian troops. In fact, the Russians retreated from the runway of Basel al-Assad airport in Latakia. They fully retreated from the runway. They lost control of the runway. Iranians then helped them to secure the airport and Haimaim base. Iran took full responsibility for evacuating Iranian troops from inside Syria. Russia didn't. And Russia was responsible for the evacuation of some Afghani, Pakistani, and some Iranian civilians, but very few, but not from the coastal areas, from the Sayda Zainab area in Damascus. You know, what I have to ask here, Mike, is why is there a necessity to obfuscate the truth? I have to start raising questions. And then if I add what I know, again, from the battlefield, I talked about the Syrian brigades that were still fighting. And at that point, so this was around the 4th of December, the president actually asked, and again, I know this through inside sources that I trust, the president asked, why is the Syrian army not fighting? Now, this coincides with the removal from the battlefield of a number of commanders, more than 10. And I have to assume the removal was carried out not by the president, because he asked the question, so one would assume he was in the dark at that point, but was carried out by the Defense Ministry, because that's the only other institution that would have the power to be able to remove commanders from the battlefield. Then who was put in charge of the entire battlefield and the forces and the operations against the terrorists? Was a commander who was known to be under the influence of the Russians. And at that point, the Syrian army started to lay down arms.
I wanted to just delve into that a little bit deeper, because earlier on I said, I asked what changed, because what you're suggesting is that somebody, if it is the Defense Ministry, but somebody made the decision to do what you've just described. Is there any indication at this stage how and why that decision was made?
The indication is very clearly that the commanders who were removed from the battlefield were the commanders who would never surrender and who would not stand down. So they were removed. And the commander who was put in charge of operations is someone under the control of Russia. Russia was paying the salaries and training them and so on for a very long time.
But who made that decision and why?
Mike, I can't tell you who. Like, I can't.
No, but what I'm trying to get at is, was somebody within the Syrian ministry told by somebody by Russia, or?
I have to. This is now I'm in the area of speculation, right? What I'm trying to make clear is when people talk about the Syrian army being infiltrated and corrupted and that they just surrendered, I don't believe this to be true, because the commanders who were removed from the battlefield were removed because they would not stand down. So whoever removed them was either aware of a plan that HTS should be allowed to take over the country, right? Because there's no other logical reason for that to happen. Because if the president is himself asking, why is the Syrian army not fighting? This suggests it was not in his hands and someone else took the decision based on what they were instructed to do, because the Ministry of Defense would not act without instruction from the president, unless the instruction was coming from, at that point, a higher power. Does that make sense?
Unless somebody had decided that the game was up in some way and they took the decision themselves. You don't buy that?
But why? When your commanders are fighting, when you have 30,000 troops, as Putin says at the press conference, why would those troops withdraw? And when people talk about the demoralization of the Syrian army, that was the case from 2011 onwards. I mean, I'm not talking about demoralization, but it's the same position, because they were never paid a huge amount, and yet they still fought for their country for 14 years. Now, I'm not saying there weren't other circumstances, like, for example, rookie soldiers that were recent conscripts that were not battle experienced, or elements that were demoralized. I'm not saying that doesn't exist. That's what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to tease out the information that I have, and I'm trying to logically work out, through understanding the nature of governance in Syria, how this could have happened. Because those commanders would not stand down unless that command came from someone that they couldn't refuse. And when I come back to the fact that those more than 10 commanders were removed from the battlefield almost simultaneously, and then the commander who was put in charge of all battle operations was someone managed effectively by Russia. So that says to me, at that point, they started to surrender. So that suggests to me that Russia had a hand in engineering the surrender and the surrendering of territory to the advancing HTS forces. And the other aspect to this, again, this is through my talking to many people within the military, within all institutions and communities inside Syria since I left, the statements being put out by the Russian military of how many terrorists they had killed were massively exaggerated. And many people have confirmed to me that the Russians were not seriously bombing anything. Look, at the point that the terrorists left Aleppo, they were in open ground. There were convoys. This is a bit like the story of the US. Why didn't they bomb ISIS when it came from Iraq to Syria, over 500 kilometers in open ground, in Toyota trucks and armored car convoys, and America did nothing. This is the same situation of those convoys traveling in the open, not underground, not in tunnels, not in caves, not in the mountains, but in open ground from Aleppo. They would be the easiest possible target for Russia. And yet their numbers didn't really decrease. And the drones warfare was still being heavily used against Syrian army positions. And one soldier actually told me that this was what was decimating their positions at the point that they were still trying to stand in Hama. And you also had the stories, and this is very much what I was receiving when I was listening to everything, when I went to Homs, when I went to the coastal areas during the battles, when the terrorists were nearing Hama, for example, which is to the north of Homs where I was. But at this point, people in Homs were already being evacuated. The message was, we're not getting any instructions from command. We don't know what to do. We don't know where we should be. We don't know where we should group. There was total confusion. But remember, this is after the commanders were removed from the battlefield and everything was under the control of one person. You know, to a large degree, I'm also trying to make sense of it, but with the help of a lot of analysis from people who were either fighting, were on the ground, or have contacts in the military and so on.
What has become with this of this commander?
We don't know. He's disappeared, but I would almost guarantee he's in Russia. That's certainly, I've asked again a number of people, and they're pretty much convinced he was whisked off to Russia. Once the order for surrender had gone out, we saw after Hama, I mean, in Homs, to a large degree, then Hezbollah was still there. And they, of course, were always going to try and defend Homs because it's crucial to the resupply of weapons to Hezbollah, because you have Al-Qusayr, you have the border crossings there, you have the Masyaf Scientific and Research Development Center, which has been responsible for the development and production of many of the rockets that, for example, Hezbollah has used, or the resistance in general has been using.
And I presume that supply line is now completely cut.
Yeah, all supply lines now. to Hezbollah are pretty much cut, as far as I'm aware.
Sorry, I don't want to divert this too much, but my understanding is that Hamas, for example, is quite supportive of HTS. So why is HTS not reciprocating?
Okay, so now we are getting into a major diversion.
Right, okay. If you don't want to go there on this one, then we won't.
Or could we go there perhaps at the end? Because I just want to focus on this scenario because people really need to understand
No, cool. That's fine.
the military scenario around what happened, because there's too much confusion on social media, in reports, and it's very clear to me that not only is social media very fast to condemn Assad, and I want to make another thing clear there. Okay, so we know on the 4th of December, he asked what's happening, like why is the Syrian army not fighting? So clearly at that point, he wasn't aware of what was happening. The second thing was he had already been in Moscow prior to coming back once the Aleppo operation had begun by the terrorist groups. So if he had pre-planned abandoning his country, why would he come back to Syria with his family, with his kids, and put them in further danger? And from my sources, I know that until the last minute, he wasn't prepared to stand down. Their opinion is that he was forced to both not respond to his closest people, and he was forced to leave Syria, obviously, probably under threat of death by HTS and so on. Until now, nobody has heard from him. We assume he's in Russia under humanitarian asylum, not political asylum. So I haven't had time to look into the legal implications of that. But I have a hunch that it means if there are any requests for example, ICC prosecution of Assad, because he's not under political asylum, is he then open to prosecution by foreign governments for whatever crimes they concoct against him? And of course, like right now, we're watching everything getting laid back on his doorstep, right? From chemical weapons to white helmets to mass graves. It's, which of course is detracting from the Israeli genocidal crimes against Palestinians also. I mean, I'm happy to talk about the Hamas issue, but I just want to clear up everything that I have so far on the situation leading up to, for example, the full surrender of the country. And if we look at the language in the Western media now I know we don't trust Western media, but we also know that it's used to put out certain narratives in order to normalize them in advance of something happening, right? And we're seeing the likes of Reuters and Bloomberg in particular, talking about Ukraine is preparing itself for it to have to accept bitter negotiations with Russia, meaning loss of territory, right? So it's being clearly stated by mainstream media. Putin, in his press conference, said that he's prepared to speak to Trump, which in Russian language means, yes, I'll speak to Trump, or I've already spoken to Trump through negotiators. He's also speaking about maintaining a military base in Syria. He can't maintain a military base in Syria without reliance on Turkey for their security inside Syria. At the same time, he's decamping to Libya, central Libya, where again, he's reliant on Turkey's reassurances, because Turkey has control of the eastern sector of Libya and the coastal area pretty much. So we have a situation now where Russia needs Turkey. It needs Turkey for its raw materials transit. It needs Turkey to assure its presence in Syria and its safety in Syria, because we've seen images of HTS terrorists like throwing rocks at Russian convoys. They don't want them there. HTS doesn't want them in Syria. The only reason that they will tolerate their presence is if Turkey and the UK and the US agree to it. And why would the US agree to it unless a deal has been done?
Does HTS actually have the capability of shifting Russia from those bases?
No, but they can make life very difficult for them. We've seen mysterious electrical fires happen in Aleppo and so on and so forth. So, I mean, it would be very easy. And HTS doesn't have control of all of the elements. What about the Chechen extremists? Who's to say that they're not going to attack the Russian base?
We're nearly out of time for this episode. and we will come on to the Hamas thing in a second, but just before we do, is the balkanization of the country a likely outcome still at this stage, or have things shifted somewhat to make that less likely?
No, it's done. I mean, Syria is now a borderless, defenseless strip of land.
This is an expression of the Greater Israel Project then?
Yeah, but we do have an element of kind of possible conflict there, of course, because Turkey has its own, or Erdogan has his own Neo-Ottoman Empire agenda, which involves the Muslim Brotherhood. And so that's in partnership with Qatar. And of course, they are talking about the pipeline project that was shelved by Assad, which led to the regime change war, was one of the factors that led to the regime change war in 2011, because Assad turned down the Qatari pipeline in favor of the Iranian-Russian pipeline. So you have Erdogan, who at the moment is collaborating with Israel to achieve what they both want inside Syria, right? Israel is going for positioning itself in order to be able to attack Damascus at any time that it wants to, should Damascus become again a threat to Israel, which isn't going to happen under HTS. Jolani has made it very clear that he's not going to engage with Israel. He's not going to allow Syrian territory to be used to attack Israel. And he's going to ensure the expulsion of Iranian and Hezbollah forces from inside Syria. So he's complying with Israel. At the same time, Israel is taking control of, bearing in mind that from the occupied Golan territory, Israel takes 30% of its water supply. Now it's taking control of the Yarmouk Basin, the Yarmouk River, the Wahdeh Dam, which provides hydroelectricity for Syria and drinking water for Jordan, a huge percentage of Jordan's clean water. It's clearly not only about the partitioning of land. This is also about the appropriation of resources, and in particular water. And we've been saying for a very long time that hydro hegemony is going to become even more important than energy resource hegemony and resource grab. At the moment, you're seeing, let's say, a cooperative partitioning of Syria. But how long is this going to last? And how long before they start fighting over the resources that are available within Syria? How long before the armed groups start fighting amongst themselves because they disagree ideologically, or the Uyghurs think that they should own Syria for their caliphate over and beyond the Uzbekistanis, the Afghanis, the HTS, and the Syrians? I mean, they're already putting out this kind of messaging. So yes, this is about partitioning Syria between Israel, the US alliance. French forces are all over Damascus right now, obviously trying to reassert their colonial identity inside Syria. But as I said, Syria is now basically a strip of land that is borderless, defenseless, has no military, and is incapable of preventing any of this happening.
Let's just end then with a brief look at the Hamas situation. And the question is ideologically, because as you've said to me in the recent past, the leadership of Hamas has been heavily changed as a result of the actions of Israel in Gaza. And so is it the case that we now have a leadership of Hamas which is more ideologically aligned with HTS than the previous leadership had been? And so the question stands, why is HTS not supporting that resistance?
Oh, because that leadership has no intention of resisting. Because that leadership, which is Khaled Mashal, was very much sidelined after 2017 by Saad Nasrallah.
Sorry, we're talking about the current Hamas leadership?
Yeah. The current Hamas leadership, which is Khaled Mashal. Khaled Mashal was responsible for the betrayal of Syria. So the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the group that is being weaponized by Turkey, by Qatar, and by the West against the Syrian government since long before 2011. I mean, the history of the Muslim Brotherhood interference in Syria at the behest of the enemies of Syria goes way back. I've written about this. I mean, after 1946 onwards, the MI6 and CIA were involved in regime change operations in Syria, which resulted in the use of the Muslim Brotherhood multiple times to topple various governments that were aligned with the Soviet Union or Russia at the time. So you now have Khaled Mashal back in control of Hamas. You have in Syria itself HTS shutting down, for example, the Palestinian brigades that were part of the Syrian Arab Army and were loyal to the Syrian army and to the Syrian government. The shutting down of the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and the Islamic Jihad, and so on. So all of the resistance factions that are not aligned with Hamas have been shut down inside Syria. They've been told they can stay, but only as refugees. They can't stay. They can't have arms. They can't form resistance. So all of the resistance that was operating from inside Syria is now completely disbanded. And Hamas now is aligned with the Turkish and Qatari agenda, and therefore with HTS and the SNA, formerly Free Syrian Army, and so on. Now what you will see, and you are seeing it from Israel, is pressure on Jordan to take the Palestinian refugees from inside Gaza. And basically what's being threatened through Israeli media and through Israeli statements is if they don't, then there will be regime change in Jordan, or there will be infiltration by the Muslim Brotherhood elements from inside Syria, which of course then brings them together with the now remodeled Hamas under Khalid Mashal. So that's why you're now seeing a reversal to Hamas's position pre-2017, which was a betrayal of the axis of resistance and a betrayal of Syria and Iran and all of these factions that were fighting for Palestinian liberation and justice.
Some people have been recently criticizing Arabs for being their own worst enemy. Is that a fair point?
No. Look, this is an incredibly racist point because white people in the West were completely manipulated and fooled by the COVID project. So imagine you have more than a century of Western intelligence interference and manipulation and intervention in your region's affairs, the carving up of your region, the creation of extremist sectarian groups under the control of the West to foment sectarian division in those countries, the creation of an entire media complex to create fear, to manipulate, to increase sectarian divisions and to use them to turn tribes, faiths, communities against each other. You wouldn't survive in the West. You wouldn't survive 5 minutes of that before you'd be tearing each other's throats out.
Well, I would argue we're seeing exactly that at the moment. Since COVID, we have absolutely seen exactly this type of thing. Yes.
So don't you dare turn around and point a finger at the Arabs who've been resisting this for an awful lot longer than Westerners have, and with far more awareness than Westerners. But it's overwhelming force. It's overwhelming military force. It's overwhelming intelligence force. It's overwhelming economic force. It's overwhelming political force, diplomatic force, the UN, every single institution that should be assuring the Arabs of a fair hearing has been totally corrupted and compromised from the beginning of the Palestinian issue. So from 1917 onwards, Palestinian voices were absolutely silenced. Journalists were deported. The Palestinian voice was not allowed to be heard from the very beginning, right? And even under the last Trump administration, Netanyahu shut down the Nakba archives. So people can't even access the Palestinian archives telling the history of the ethnic cleansing in 1948. So people who turn against the Arabs because they have been infiltrated by their governments, I find that absolutely abhorrent and racist and utterly unfair. Why aren't those, when those people are calling for Palestinians to rise up against the Palestinian Authority, for example, why aren't those people focusing on rising up against their regime? Why aren't they rising up against the UK regime or the US regime that is behind what is happening in Palestine and has been from the very beginning of the Zionist settler colonialist project? Why do they get off scot-free? Why is the finger pointed at Arabs to die because Western governments have created the hell that they're living in right now. Point the finger at your own government. Do something against your own government for once, because this is coming to you. It's already come to you. And you're not going to find Arabs pointing the finger at you and saying, see, like stupid Westerners, they fall for it every time. It's disgusting. I'm disgusted by people that have done that.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, well, thank you very much, Vanessa, for joining me today. That has been, again, another fascinating conversation. I'm quite sure we're going to do more because there's so much more to unpack. And of course, events will move on.
And can I just say again also that this is based on what I know now, right? And as I work on this and as more information comes to light, which it's going to, I'm not saying it's going to change what I already know, but it might add greater complexity to it and more nuance to it. So I'm not at this stage kind of concluding anything. I'm just working through it in a as logical, rational a way as I possibly can.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Fascinating conversation, and we'll see you next time.
Take care. Happy Christmas, everyone.